The Battle of the Atlantic was the defining arena for naval warfare in the early years of the Second World War. The Battle of the Pacific between the Allies and Japan would come later, but significant battles also raged in another, smaller ocean to the north, the Arctic Ocean. That frigid ocean was the location of raids by German ships and submarines against Allied vessels going to and from the Soviet Union. We need to remember that the USSR was an Allied country during World War II and needed all the help it could get in terms of supplies. The Allies desperately needed the Soviets as an eastern flank to Nazi Germany. The Arctic convoys did much to keep that alliance going. One of the biggest skirmishes in the Arctic was the so-called Battle of the Barents Sea that took place on the last day of 1942. The outcome was anything but great for the Germans. Let's just say that Adolf Hitler was anything but happy with the outcome. First, some context is needed. As already stated, Allied supplies were vital in keeping the Soviet Union viable as an ally. Convoys to and from the Soviet Union via the treacherous Arctic Ocean was the best way to achieve that. There was only one problem. Germany had occupied Norway since April 9, 1940, for the primary goal of ensuring that they could keep careful watch of the Arctic to the north of the Scandinavian country. In particular, the Allies, and especially the British, were petrified of the giant German battleship, the Tirpitz. The German Bismarck-class battleship was stationed in and about the deep fjords of northern Norway, posing a constant threat. The British knew that Tirpitz could wreak havoc on their vessels traveling in the north. Getting rid of the German battleship became a national obsession for the Brits. We mention this because it's one of the factors that hindered Allied operations during the first 3 years of the war. It also explains why there was such a huge concentration of Allied ships in the region, even though the Arctic is a relatively small ocean. Many convoys were undertaken, but there was constant trepidation about Tirpitz and German naval forces in the region. The irony is that Tirpitz never fired a single shot against any British ship, but the fear of what it could do was still very real. Another factor that hampered Allied convoys in the Arctic was very simple. It was a downright awful place to conduct shipping convoys. The Arctic convoys of World War II typically sailed from Britain, Iceland, or North America to northern ports in the Soviet Union. The two Soviet ports most commonly used were those of Arkhangelsk and Murmansk in what is modern-day Russia. A total of 78 convoys occurred between August 1941 and May 1945, in which approximately 1,400 merchant ships delivered essential supplies to the Soviet Union. These convoys of merchant ships were escorted by ships of Britain's Royal Navy, the Royal Canadian Navy, and later in the war, the U.S. Navy. The Allied losses were huge, however, with 85 merchant vessels sunk and a further 16 Royal Navy warships also lost, including 6 destroyers, 2 cruisers, and 8 other escort vessels. On the German side, the Kriegsmarine lost 1 battleship, 3 destroyers, and no less than 30 U-boats in the various battles that occurred in the Arctic. Unsurprisingly, conditions on board ships could be horrendous due to the often freezing cold weather, not to mention gale-force winds, rolling fogs and whiteouts, sea ice, and other perils of traversing the world's coldest ocean. The Arctic convoys were considered the most dangerous of any convoy routes in the world during the war. They were certainly the most deadly. And now for some more important context. The Allies, and British in particular, may have had their fears about Germany's naval prowess, but the Kriegsmarine had its share of issues. In short, it wasn't that prepared for naval warfare. Erich Raeder was Grand Admiral, or Oberbefehlshaber der Kriegsmarine, and he was well aware of the German Navy's shortcomings. That is why he opted for the strategy known as guerre de course, or commerce raiding, in which surprise and relentless raids were done on merchant ships. This strategy was devastatingly effective for the first 2 years of the war, as scores of Allied merchant vessels were sunk by German ships. However, this strategy had started to wane by 1942. The Allies had become far more effective at providing air cover for their merchant convoys, as well as tracking German ships and submarines. Their convoys were far tighter too. Furthermore, the Americans had entered the war at the end of 1941, providing more naval assistance to the Allied effort. That is why the Germans were so intent on hitting Allied convoys in the Arctic. They needed as much as possible to thwart Allied efforts to help the Soviet Union. The designation provided to the convoy that left Scapa Flow in the Orkney Islands on December 22, 1942 was JW 51B. The convoy of merchant ships comprised 7 ships from the United States, 5 British ships and 2 Panamanian-registered vessels. The cargo on board the 14 ships was impressive, including 87 fighter planes, 33 bomber aircraft, 202 tanks, 2,046 other vehicles, 12,650 tons of aviation fuel, 11,500 tons of motor fuel, and just over 49,000 tons of other supplies bound for the Soviet Union. This convoy of 14 merchant ships met up with its fleet of patrol ships off Iceland on Christmas Day. Protection was to be provided by 6 British destroyers, namely the Acades, the Obdurate, the Obedient, the Onslow, the Oribe, and the Orwell, as well as 2 corvettes, the Hyderabad and the Rhododendron, the minesweeper Bramble, and 2 armed trawlers, the Northern Gem and the Visalma. The entire convoy was under the command of Captain Sherbrooke on board the Onslow. Additional distant cover for the convoy was provided by 2 British cruisers, the Sheffield and the Jamaica, under the helm of Rear Admiral Burnett. The destination was the Kola Inlet on Russia's extreme northwestern Arctic coast. Strong gales on December 28th and 29th scattered the merchant ships all over the Barents Sea, a marginal sea of the Arctic Ocean to the north of Norway and Russia. This made them far more vulnerable to attack by German vessels. And that German threat was lying in wait in a Norwegian fjord. Unternehmen Regenbogen, or Operation Rainbow, was the German effort to take on the JW 51B convoy. The Germans were based in the Altafjord of northern Norway and comprised the 2 heavy cruisers, the Admiral Hipper and the Lutzow, as well as 6 destroyers, the Friedrich Eckholt, Richard Beitzen, Theodor Riedel, Z-29, Z-30, and Z-31. The fleet was commanded by Vice-Admiral or Vice Admiral Oskar Kummetz. 4 U-boats positioned off Bear Island in the Barents Sea would form the patrol line for the fleet of surface ships. The fleet itself set out as 2 battle groups. The one German group would engage with the military ships escorting the convoy, while the other group would directly attack the convoy of merchant ships. The aim was simple: sink as many merchant ships as possible. Oh, and Hitler ordered that not a single German ship be lost. That diktat by the Führer himself hindered the operation before it even set off into the Barents Sea on December 31st. The Allied convoy had first been sighted by U-354 on December 30th, although German reconnaissance aircraft had already spotted it on Christmas Eve. Kummetz was immediately ordered by Berlin to intercept the convoy and destroy it. Things came to a head at 8:20 in the morning on December 31st when one of the British ships, Obdurate, spotted 3 German destroyers to the rear of the convoy. Another British ship, Onslow, then spotted the German heavy cruiser, the Admiral Hipper, also to the rear of the convoy. Onslow, along with 3 other destroyers, Obdurate, Obedient, and Orwell, changed course in order to intercept the German heavy cruiser. The Admiral Hipper was able to eventually hit the Onslow with its second effort, killing 17 men on board and injuring Captain Sherbrooke in the process. The German ship then fired and hit the British minesweeper Bramble, which was finished off by another German ship, the destroyer Friedrich Eckholt. The Admiral Hipper then fired at one of the British destroyers, the Acades, as well as the Obedient. The Acades was badly damaged and would sink sometime later, resulting in the loss of 113 men. Sheffield and Jamaica approached unseen and opened fire on Admiral Hipper at 11:35, hitting her with enough 6-inch shells to damage and cause minor flooding to 2 of her boiler rooms, reducing her speed to 28 knots. Kummetz initially thought that the attack of the 2 cruisers was coming from another destroyer, but upon realizing his mistake, he ordered his ships to retreat to the west. In another case of mistaken identity, Friedrich Eckholt and Richard Beitzen mistook Sheffield for Admiral Hipper. After attempting to form up with the British ships, they were engaged by Sheffield with Friedrich Eckholt breaking in 2 and sinking with all hands. Lutzow approached from the east and fired ineffectively at the convoy, still hidden by smoke from the crippled Acades. Heading northwest to join Admiral Hipper, Lutzow also encountered Sheffield and Jamaica, which opened fire. Vice Admiral Kummetz, not knowing where the firing was coming from, ordered the German ships to retreat. Suddenly, just before noon, both sides decided almost simultaneously to cease fire. They no doubt wanted to take stock of what was going on amid all the smoke, fire, and confusion. 2 British ships shadowed the retreating German ships until it became clear that the latter were heading for the safety of the Altafjord. The remaining British ships gathered into a tighter convoy and made their way eastward to the Kola Inlet, which they all safely reached. Confusion reigned throughout the battle, with ships often not sure what other vessels they were firing on or being fired at. There were critical reasons why the battle was such a mass of confusion. For one thing, it took place at the darkest time of the year in the Arctic region, known as the polar night, and that means very, very dark. And it was clear that both the German and British ships were not only scattered all over the place, but also unsure of their respective positions, including relative to both friendly and enemy ships. The confusion was such that the Germans thought they'd sunk a destroyer, when in fact Bramble was a minesweeper. However, they didn't even realize that they had caused the eventual sinking of the British destroyer, Acades. Imagine going into battle and mistaking one type of ship sunk for another, and not even realizing that another ship had in fact also been sunk due to your fire. It was a mess. Although 2 British ships had been sunk during the Battle of the Barents Sea, it soon reached Berlin that all 14 merchant ships had successfully reached the Soviet Union. As such, in terms of its intended mission, the German attack on the Allied JW 51B convoy was a complete failure. To say that Adolf Hitler was enraged by the failure is an understatement. Grand Admiral Erich Raeder was ordered to Berlin and had to endure a screaming outburst by the Führer that lasted 90 minutes. At the end of it, Raeder offered his resignation, which was promptly accepted by Hitler. Raeder was immediately replaced by Admiral Karl Dönitz, who was much liked by Hitler. Of critical importance, Dönitz was the head of the Navy's U-boat division. Hitler had never had full faith in surface ships and ordered that U-boats now be the focus of Germany's naval strategy. Hitler went further. He was so enraged by the debacle that occurred in the Barents Sea that he demanded that all surface ships in the Kriegsmarine be scuttled. He proclaimed, or rather screamed, that only U-boats had the effectiveness to wage naval war. Naval Command was understandably horrified at Hitler's outburst, knowing his demands could be met and that all Germany's surface ships were in danger of being destroyed. Luckily, Karl Dönitz himself came to the rescue and calmed Hitler down, assuring him that the surface ships could still play a viable role in Germany's navy. Ironically, it was the man until then synonymous with submarines that saved German surface ships from destruction. The Battle of the Barents Sea and its own Operation Regenbogen was an unmitigated failure for the Germans. What it did was place even further importance on the U-boat division. Until then, the U-boats had done a stellar job for Germany in the Battle of the Atlantic. That would change in 1943, but they were nevertheless front and center from then onwards in the Kriegsmarine. The response by Hitler, though demented, was not atypical of leaders in times of war. There has always been a demand that battleships deliver crushing blows to enemies in naval battles. That expectation can be somewhat unrealistic at times. As the chief of the Italian General Staff, Marshal Pietro Badoglio, once remarked, "The conception of a naval battle as an end in itself is absurd." Britain's first Sea Lord, Admiral Dudley Pound, echoed that sentiment when he stated in 1942 that it is only the politicians who imagine that ships are not earning their keep unless they are madly rushing about the ocean. German ships madly rushing about the Arctic Ocean was certainly the expectation of Adolf Hitler.